All right, we are in Judges chapter 11, part 2, Jephthah's rash vow. Jephthah's rash vow. So let's get refreshed about Jephthah. Okay, remember that he is a son from a concubine relationship between Gilead and an unnamed woman. Excuse me, and because of that, his stepbrothers drove him out, pushed him out into exile because they were not going to want the inheritance split one more share. Jephthah, as we discovered, is a mighty warrior, and he has, excuse me, evidently been involved with some military conquests as an exile, kind of very similar to David on what he did. And we also were reminded last week that the Ammonites are gathering together to battle Israel. And there is no one above the upper echelon in Gilead that is willing to take the lead and bring them into battle. And so they contact Jephthah. They locate him in the desert area of Tob, and they make a covenant with him, calling on God to be a witness that they want him to come back and they will restore him back into his rightful standing. And Jephthah says, okay, if the Lord gives me the victory and you will reinstate me, and they call God in as a witness. And there is victory. God gives him victory. And so we are going to pick it up here with this thought beginning in verse 29 of Judges 11. Now the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. Now keep in mind, in the Old Testament, the Spirit of God did not indwell anybody. The Spirit of God came upon people for a specific work, for a specific time. There was not an indwelling, permanent relationship like the believer has today. And so the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah, verse 29, so that he passed through Gilead and Manasseh. Then he passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he went on to the sons of Ammon. So we're getting a little AAA roadmap here of his proceedings. Jephthah made a vow, verse 30. Now this is where we want to slow down a little bit. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed give me the sons of Ammon into my hands, then it shall be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon, it shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Now, you have a statement there, letter 4. Jephthah's trust in God turns to testing God. And the reason I have phrased it that way is because if you go back to chapter 11 and take a look at verse 8 and 9, the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, for this reason we have now returned to you, that you may go with us and fight with the sons of Ammon and become head over all the inhabitants of Gilead. So Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, if you take me back to fight against the sons of Ammon, and the Lord gives them to me, then I will become your head. That verse speaks to me of confidence that Jephthah has. And I believe I can support this from the fact that he has been battling successfully with Ammon and other Canaanite tribes in the area where he has been exiled to. So he has a confidence in God. He's asserting this confidence in God. So that raises a question in my mind in verse 30. Why are you testing God here? If you will indeed give me the sons of Ammon into my hand. this kind of reverberates from this morning's message about testing God. And he makes a rash vow. I think when our trust has to be supported by testing God and not trusting God, we can make a rash vow. And this is what he does. The vow that he makes is that whatever comes out to greet me after I have been victorious and I return home, I will give it to the Lord as a burnt offering. I will offer it up as a burnt offering, verse 31. Well, let's see what happens here. God gives Jephthah the victory. You can read about that up to verse 28. It shows how God granted him the victory. And Jephthah returns home in victory. He is happy, he is excited. But as he comes home, the scriptures tell us that his daughter comes out to greet him, his only child. Now, we have no clue who Jephthah's wife is. We don't have the name of the daughter. We don't know whether the wife is still living or not. We don't know whether she has been captured and taken away. Jephthah returns home. His daughter comes out with tambourines, celebrating his safe return home. And Jephthah says, "You're the worst thing that I could see today. You are bringing grief to my heart." So that's the setting here that we need to talk about vows. Jephthah made a vow. So, what is the types of sacrifice that God accepts? Well, you will find these in Leviticus chapter 1 through 5. Chapter 1 through 5. And I'm just going to read a couple of verses from each of these sacrifices that God says to bring for certain situations. And I want you to look for the common denominator. In chapter 1, verse 1, talking about the burnt offering, then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd of the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be acceptable before the Lord." The grain offering is in chapter 2. Now, when anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his grain offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. He shall then bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and shall take from it his handful of its fine flour and of its oil with all of its frankincense. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke as a memorial portion on the altar, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. The peace offering, chapter 3. Now, if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he is going to offer out of the herd, whether male or female, he shall offer it without defect before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and slay it at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood around on the altar. Chapter 4, the sin offering. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, and commits any of them, if the anointed priest sins so as to bring guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord a bull without defect as a sin offering for the sin that he has committed." Chapter 5, the guilt offering. Now, if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify, when he is a witness, whether he has seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, then he will bear his guilt. Or a person touches anything unclean, etc. And the sacrifice or the offering is an animal. So the common denominator is either grain or an animal. not a human being. So that's our first clue that Jephthah did not offer his daughter as a burnt offering as understood according to Leviticus. The burnt offering, peace, sin, and guilt offering were animals. The grain offering, by virtue of the name, was a grain offering. Now, did God prohibit human sacrifices? This is where you need to get your fingers nimbled, because I'm going to be reading these passages. You have them there on the extended notes, and this becomes another very important, vital piece to understand. In Leviticus 18:21, look at all these verses that God condemns human sacrifices because they were a part of the pagan culture, and he did not want his children involved with that. So in Leviticus 18:21, it says, "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Moloch, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord." Now he's talking about Moloch, which is a pagan Canaanite god that was satisfied by human sacrifice. In chapter 20, verse 2 and 3, "You shall also say to the sons of Israel, any man from the sons of Israel or from the aliens sojourning in Israel who gives any of his offspring to Moloch shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones." Deuteronomy chapter 12 continues the same theme and becomes more specific here in these verses. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 31 says this: "You shall not behave," see if I got the right, yeah, Deuteronomy 12:31, "You shall not behave thus towards the Lord your God, for every abominable act which the Lord hates, they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods." So what is the Lord saying? Don't do it. Don't be like the pagan people that you are living and being surrounded by. That's why one of the reasons God said, wipe them out and get them out of your inheritance so you don't learn their ways. Chapter 18, verse 10, "There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer." Pass through the fire. Turn to 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 26, verses 26 and 27. 2 Kings chapter 2 says this, as I turn my pages with my cold fingers. Here we go. 2 Kings, it's chapter 3, verse 26 and 27. "When the king of Moab saw the battle was too fierce for him, he took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through to the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And there came great wrath against Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land." 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 2 and 3 read this way. 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 2 and 3. "Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his father David had done, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and even made his son pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had driven out from before the sons of Israel." Chapter 17 verse 16 and 17. They forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served Baal. Then they made their sons and daughters pass through the fire and practiced divination and enchantments and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him. Turn to Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 30 and 31 says this: For the sons of Judah have done that which is evil in my sight, declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house which is called by my name to defile it. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind. Chapter 19, verse 5 of Jeremiah says this: And have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, a thing which I never commanded or spoke of, nor did it even enter my mind. And then in chapter 32, verse 35, Jeremiah records these words. Jeremiah 32, verse 35 says this: They built the high places of Baal that are in the valley of Ben Hinnom, to cause their sons and daughters to pass through the fire to Molech, which I had not commanded them, nor had it entered my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. All right, so does God permit human sacrifices? And the resounding answer is what? No, he does not. He would not accept a human sacrifice. Aha! What do you do about Abraham then? In Genesis 22, where God tested Abraham, verse 1 of Genesis 22, and God told Abraham, I want you to take your son. Let's see, I've got 2. I've got Isaac and Ishmael. I want to take your son, your only begotten son. Well, I still have 2, Isaac and Ishmael. The one that you love, Isaac. Because Sarah's conniption fit, Abraham yielded to and drove Ishmael and his mother out into the wilderness. And God made a promise to them that he would take care of them and Ishmael would become a mighty nation. And that's what you see today over in the Middle East. And so in chapter 22, verse 1, God says, I'm going to test you, Abraham. And so he tells Abraham, I want you to take the son that you love, and I want you to go to a place that I'm going to show you, and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice. Now, as you read that, and then you stop and think of all the verses we just read, there seems to be a contradiction, because you know the story. They journeyed for 3 days. They finally arrive at the place. Isaac even says, where's the sacrifice? Abraham ties him up, lays him on top of the altar, has the knife in his hand, and is about to plunge it in the promised child's heart. And God calls to Abraham twice. Abraham was so focused and intent on obeying God, God called him twice. And God specifically said this in Genesis 22. Let me back up. And this is what God told Abraham. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not stretch your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now, in Hebrews, in the Hall of Faith, chapter 11, Abraham, or the Spirit of God records that Abraham believed in the resurrection. And if he had to follow through, the promised child would be replaced or restored. But don't miss the context here. God is not looking for a human sacrifice. If God permitted Abraham to kill his son, that would have proved, in my opinion, a legalistic obedience and nothing more. Abraham loved Isaac. He had waited so long for God to fulfill the promise. He had been involved in raising Isaac, seeing him grow and mature, and it was such a joy to him. And God says, I need to test you. I need to test you. Do you love me more than Isaac? If I ask you to give Isaac up, would you be willing to do that? And would you still love me? That's the point of the story, not the possibility of a human sacrifice, because God didn't change his mind after Genesis 22 and record some dozen times, this thought never came into my mind. God has got to be consistent from before the foundations of the world to the end of the world. So this is not a matter of human sacrifice. Now, did Jephthah offer the first thing that came forth to meet him? Let me go back to Judges and let's see what transpires here in chapter 11. It says in chapter 11, Jephthah made a vow, verse 30. And verse 34, he returns home. When Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, behold, his daughter was coming out to meet him with tambourines and with dancing. Now she was his one and only child. Beside her, he had no son or daughter. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, now the tearing of clothes by a Hebrew is an intense sign of mourning, an intense sign of grief and pain and sorrow. Sometimes, like Job, they would tear their clothes and they would sit in ashes and throw ashes on their head, symbolic of tremendous mourning. I just saw a little bit of a glimpse of the mass grave that was dug in Afghanistan for those 50 girls that were murdered by the Taliban, who claimed that they did not do it, and the mourning that they were involved with, still following pretty much the Eastern custom. And Jephthah tears his clothes, verse 35, and he says, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you are among those who trouble me. For I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot take it back. Jephthah made a vow, and he's a man of integrity. He is going to pay this vow. And what was the vow? I will offer the first thing that comes out of my door as a burnt offering to you, Lord. That was his vow. And he looks at his beautiful daughter, deep into her eyes, is deeply grieved, and says, I've got to keep my word. And notice her response. She says something where Isaac, in reality, did not say anything except, where's the sacrifice? She says in verse 36, my father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have said, since the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the sons of Ammon. She's willing for her dad to complete his vow, and that she would be the sacrifice to satisfy his vow, because the Bible says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And we're going to look at how serious vows are. Goes on to say in verse 37, she said to her father, let this thing be done to me. Let me alone for 2 months, that I might go to the mountains and weep because of my virginity, I and my companions. And he said, Go. So he sent her away for 2 months, and she left with her companions and wept on the mountains because of her virginity. And at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did to her according to the vow which he had made. And she had no relations with a man. Thus it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite for 4 days in the year. Now, I find this kind of strange, that if she was going to be a burnt offering, she's asking to be sent away for 2 years to grieve and mourn over the fact that she will not be married and have kids. That seems kind of strange. Maybe I'm looking at it from a male perspective. I guess if I know that I'm going to be a burnt offering, just get it over with. I don't need 2 months to fuss and fume about this. So there's something about this virginity that plays into our understanding of Jephthah's vow. Now, what do we learn from Hannah? Hannah prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow. It wasn't a burnt offering, but she made a vow. She said, Lord, if you will grant me a son, I will return him to you for service. And after she had weaned him and there was some stability there, maybe age 2 or 3, she took Samuel and entrusted him. Now stop and let this blow your mind, of all people, to Eli. And she kept her vow. It was, I will return this gift that you have given to me to you. I promised I would give him back. As much as I enjoy his curly hair and his eyes and everything else, I made a vow, I'll give him back to you. And Lord, she did. And he became a great leader in the nation of Israel. Jephthah did fulfill his vow. Was it a burnt offering as we read about in Leviticus chapter 1? I suggest to you with great certainty, absolutely not. There is too much scriptures about God prohibiting human sacrifices. It wasn't a burnt offering as understood in Leviticus chapter 1. So what are we talking about here? The fulfillment of the vow by Jephthah would be his daughter's perpetual service in the tabernacle like Samuel. She would not be able to be married. She would not bear children, but she would be a female servant in the tabernacle, dedicating herself to serve the Lord in whatever role the high priest would designate her to do. It's not a burnt vow, a burnt sacrifice as in Leviticus chapter 1, but it was a burnt sacrifice, if you please, of complete dedication. If you read Leviticus 1 through 5, except for the grain offering, which involved all the animals, burnt, peace, sin, and guilt, it was a complete dedication of that animal to the process of the sacrifice, to be obedient to what God required. You have this with Samuel. You have this with Jephthah's daughter. Yes, Jephthah fulfilled his vow. And imagine how painful that must have been for him not to be a grandfather, not to be involved with the arrangement of the marriage for his daughter, and seeing her every time he went to offer his sacrifices, to see his daughter there. But I believe that there was a peace in his heart And I believe there was a joy in his daughter's life because she understood what was taking place and she willingly participated. Rick, you're arguing from silence of Scripture. Yes, I am. Same way I argue in silence from Scripture about Isaac, who did not throw a fuss about being wrapped up, laying on top of a stone altar, and watching his father arm with a knife in it heading towards his chest. So that's what I think what the vow was. Now, what are some life lessons here? Your belief in God should translate into trust. Your trust must never test God with a vow. A vow says, a vow indicates your lack of trust. If you read vows in the Bible, they often start out with the word if. If you will give me victory, if you will give me a child, if. That's not confidence. That's not trust in what God said. And I believe Jephthah had that confidence when the men of Gilead first came and proposed to him the solution. Now, the Bible takes a person's vows seriously. A vow is an affirmative statement to act. It's a promise. It is something very, very serious. Now, it is very unfortunate in our world and culture today that somebody says, oh, yes, I'll do that, and they don't show up. They don't do what they say that they're going to do. And we see this at the most central hub of society called marriage. Called marriage. And I am trying to stress to this young couple that I'm doing premarital counseling with about the significance of the day that they exchange their vows. They're making a vow to each other. They're making a vow before their friends and family. And they're making a vow to God. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 4 and 5, it says this, when you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. James chapter 5, verse 12. I'm going to skip around here a little bit if you're trying to keep up. James chapter 5, verse 12 says this. But above all, my brethren, do not swear, that's the same thing as making a vow, either by heaven or by earth, or with any other oath. But your yes is to be yes, and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. Then in Numbers chapter 31, I'm not going to read all these verses, but let me just read the first couple of portions because it sets up a number of scenarios about making vows. In Numbers 31, beginning in verse 1, it says this. And my pages are sticking again. Here we go. Numbers 31. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take full vengeance for the sons of Israel on the Midianites. Afterwards you shall be gathered to your people. Moses spoke to the people, saying, arm men from among you for the war, that they may go against Midian to execute the Lord's vengeance. And I'm looking for Numbers 31. Okay, let me scan down here because it does talk about making a vow. Well, maybe I have the wrong chapter. Go to Matthew chapter 5. I apologize about that. I'll have to try to correct that. Matthew chapter 5, verse 33 to 37. Sometimes I type faster than what I see. Matthew 5. Not Matthew 31, Matthew 5. All right, here we go. 33 to 37. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven or by its throne of God. Now, understand something here. When people made vows back then, they were swearing by heaven, they were swearing by the throne of God. And Jesus is saying that's an improper way to make a vow. Verse 34, but I say to you, make no vow either by heaven or on the throne of God or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of God. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be this: yes is yes, no is no. Anything beyond that, there is evil. Jephthah made a vow, and he knew the seriousness of it, and he told his daughter, I've got to keep the vow. And I believe, and this is from the silence of Scripture, she understood what that vow was, because she knew that she would not lose her virginity in a marital relationship, and that's why she asks for 2 months to go and mourn the fact that she would be a perpetual virgin, never to be married, never to bear children. Vows are important. A vow is a promise. And so if you tell somebody you're going to do something, if you make a promise that you're going to do something, please make sure it is not an ICU promise or a foxhole. You understand what I'm saying? ICU promise. Oh Lord, if you just heal me, I'll serve you forever. Foxhole promise. Lord, if you get me out of this, and I don't die, I'll be a pastor. And guess what happens? They go home, and they never enter vocational study to be a pastor, or they are healed and they never serve the Lord. Those are false vows. Those are foxhole vows. Those are ICU vows. As stated above, do what you say, keep your word. The Bible talks that sometimes you make a vow and you will swear to your own hurt. That's in Proverbs. What does that mean? That means you commit to do something and you begin to realize that you didn't think things through, or something better came along. And so you try to get out of doing something that you said that you would do. You're not keeping your word. You didn't think it through. Now, whether you thought it through or not, or whether something better came along or not, is not the issue. You made a vow. You told someone you were going to do something. Even if you lose out on the 50-yard line watching your favorite football team, free of charge, you better keep your vow. And then there are ramifications, beloved, when we make vows, both positive and negative. If you break your word, it's going to have a negative effect. Just think about a family situation to where dad breaks his word. Now, occasionally that might take place, but when it becomes a repeated pattern, the child will become embittered towards his father. On the positive end, if a dad or a mom, parents, a boss, somebody keeps their word and follows through on what they're going to say, what you're doing is you're cultivating a deeper relationship with that person of trust. And that is very, very important. And then finally, vows we make can affect the next generation, whether positive or whether negative. Sometimes when you read the Bible, you wonder what happened to Jephthah's daughter. You wonder how her life played out. And the Lord did not see fit to include a postscript. But I believe we can have confidence that because Jephthah kept his end of the vow, God was going to use her in a very significant way, serving in the tabernacle. All right, questions that you might have, thoughts that you might have, disagreements that you might have?
Pastor, it's Carl.
Yes, sir.
And I went through, I'm going back through the Bible again. I just went through I think I'm in Deuteronomy now, but I just went through all this with the redemption, and in Numbers, it does talk about that the firstborn of man and animal belong to God, and even though since Jephthah only had a daughter, she actually belonged to God. I guess I'm just spitballing here, that she would belong to him as well. And then in the unclean animals and the sons were to be redeemed at the price of 5 shekels of silver for the sons and the unclean animals, I guess, were supposed to be redeemed back. And I think that was after the golden calf, I think, because before that, the firstborn of every tribe in Israel was supposed to be dedicated to the Lord for service. But I think from what I understand, after the golden calf, only Aaron's sons or the Levites were acceptable, because they were the only tribe that did not succumb to worshiping the golden calf. Am I on track here?
You're on track. That's an excellent observation, Carl. Excellent. You're right on point. You're right on point. Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, I've never heard a preacher say that Jephthah tied up his daughter and offered her as a burnt offering. But I've heard some other, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right explanations. And I hope with the scriptures that I've given to you tonight that you're going to walk away with a couple of things. One, God would not accept a burnt offering, that he condemned it in so many different places. And the whole idea of a burnt offering, if you take a look at those in Leviticus, it was a total dedication, it was a total commitment of that animal to fulfill the requirements of God. And so if you run a parallel to this, I think we can conclude with a clear conscience and rightfully, without biblical malfeasance here, that the burnt offering for Jephthah's daughter was her life of dedication in service in the tabernacle. Especially when you got to factor in, why did she want 2 months to mourn her virginity? It just doesn't make sense if you're going to be a human sacrifice. What would it matter at that? What would 2 months do? And so I hope that we have maybe a clearer understanding of what took place. And, we focus in on the rash vow, but maybe spend some time thinking about what Jephthah went through. He didn't realize the vow that he was making. And that's why he said he was testing God, because he had confidence earlier, but then he comes up with this if deal. And so he's testing God with this vow, a rash vow. And by the way, the first thing that comes out of a Jew's home could have been an animal, because animals lived in the courtyard of the Jewish establishment. So it could have been a sheep or a goat, a cat or a dog, but it was his daughter. But think about it from his perspective. First of all, he's a man of integrity, and he's going to do what he said he's going to do. But think of the emotional heartache. It's seeing there where he says, you have brought grief into my life. No, she didn't bring grief into your life. You brought grief into your own life with the vow that you made. You never should have made the vow. But that's beside the point. You did. You're going to keep the vow. But no, he would not be a part of arranging her marriage because he would have been a part of that. He would not be there for the birth of a child, a granddaughter, or a grandson. The only time that he would see her is when he went to the tabernacle and made his sacrifices. But I believe he had peace when he saw her, and I believe that she had joy in what she was doing, even though that they were estranged in that way. Thoughts? Any other?